Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the podcast. It's episode 116. And in this episode, I talk with Bryant about how to help kids and students and really anybody belong before they can believe in a church setting. And we talk about his book, Not For Me, which used to be called Peppermint-Filled Pinatas. You might be familiar with that. But we talk about, what does that look like? How do you do that? What was his experience at Mosaic Church in LA with Erwin McManus, and then at Gateway in Austin with John Burke, two churches that do this really well. And so you're like me, probably you lead in some area of children's or student ministry or next gen ministry. And most of our conversation, I would say, is bigger than that. You know, we're talking whole church, we're talking reaching people, adults, families, the whole thing. And we dive in and talk about kids and students and what does that look like in those areas. But I just love the conversation overall. As a church leader, I just learned a lot from it. I appreciated Eric's insights, and I've definitely been influenced by those two churches and Eric and others and their approach to reaching people. So I think you're going to love the conversation. Before we jump into that interview, there are two big things I want to tell you about. One is the Ministry Boost free online event. It is this Thursday, if you're listening to the podcast when it comes out. So be sure to register, even if you can't attend the event live online, which I hope you can. We're going to give away a bunch of prizes, interact. You'll be able to ask questions of everybody who's speaking. We have 6 great sessions that cover topics that I know you care about most: volunteers, recruiting and empowering volunteers, empowering students to serve, partnering with parents, small groups for kids and students, aligning your next gen team so you work as one team from birth all the way through high school and into college and young adult years and all that. So there's great sessions. We're giving away over $2,000 worth of stuff. But I know some of you won't be able to attend on, in person, online on Thursday. And if that's the case, that's cool. But there will be a replay available. So you'll want to sign up so that you get that replay link when it's over. We have a lot of other fun things in store. We're giving away a ton of stuff. And also some bonus videos and content that we're recording now by interviewing some other leaders, kind of like you hear about on this podcast, but it's a little bit of a different angle. So sign up for that. If you haven't already, you can do that at ministryboost.org. The other thing I want to tell you about is the Orange Tour. The Orange Tour is coming to a ton of cities this fall. I have taken my team to the Orange Tour, tons of volunteers, our staff, every year since it started. And in fact, I have a post coming out on Orange Leaders blog that you can see soon where I kind of go back in the DeLorean time machine to 10 years ago or more. I guess it was about 10 years ago when we went to the very first Orange Tour. And it was a lot of fun. And there are a couple stories I tell in that post. But what I would tell you is we go every year because it's a great team thing for us, for volunteers and staff to gather. It's great to connect with other leaders, that are in our area. It's great to connect with the Orange team. We love the ideas, the insights and all of that we learn at the Orange Tour. So if you haven't registered for the Orange Tour, I would highly recommend it. You can go to orangetour.org, and you want to do that before the price increases. So ministryboost.org, orangetour.org. I hope you check out both of those. But let's go ahead now and jump into my conversation with Bryant about helping kids and students and really anyone belong before they believe. Today I'm talking with Bryant. Welcome to the podcast, Eric.
Hello, Nick. Thanks for having me.
You bet. How about you introduce us to yourself, your family, your church, for anybody who's not familiar with you and your setting. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Yes, I'm serving here at a church in Austin, Texas called Gateway, along with our senior pastor, John Burke. I've been here almost 8 years, and before that, I was serving alongside Erwin McManus at Mosaic, which is a church in Los Angeles. Before that, I was part of a church plant in Seattle, but really kindergarten through college, I grew up in Texas, married my college sweetheart. Her name is Deborah, and we have a 19-year-old son and a 16-year-old daughter. And so I'm the campus pastor for Gateway in South Austin, and we see ourselves as a campus that plants campuses. So just really love getting to do what I do and with the people that I get to do it with.
That's awesome. And we want to talk a little bit about your book, which is new but not new, right? Like the title's Not Like Me, but that's a new updated version with a new
That's
title.
right.
So tell us about the book, the old title, like what's it about, and what's new in the updated version?
Sure. So having grown up in the Bible Belt and then moving out to Seattle to plant a church, we were there for 4 years. We had 4 senior pastors in those 4 years, so we learned how not to plant. And it was a very post-Christian, anti-Christian city. And then moving to Los Angeles, which had its own kind of challenges as a mission field, and being there for 13 years. Really, my time, whether it was church planting or my early days in Los Angeles, was in student ministry and trying to figure out how do we reach and disciple kids in a fast-changing world. And so really along the way, in about 2005, Erwin encouraged me to write a book on engaging with people who are different than us. They might believe differently. They might look differently. They might vote differently. They might make different choices than we would. But really writing kind of, in some ways, my journey of coming out of the Bible Belt and being a part of a church for churched people. And how do we engage with the unchurched world? And so the book came out in 2007. It was called Peppermint-Filled Piñatas, Breaking Through Tolerance and Embracing Love. And in many ways, it was a chance to just kind of share my journey of being a part of a church that allows people to belong before they believe. And then a few years later, a church in Chicago did a sermon series called Not Like Me, and they used my book alongside of it. The original title was kind of a homage to Blue Like Jazz. The publisher thought it'd be clever to name it something no one knows what it means. And so once that church decided to do the sermon series, but call it Not Like Me, the publisher came back with an idea of changing the name. And so we did that in 2010. But here we are in 2018, and so much has changed in the last 10 years. So we republished. It's now called Not Like Me, Learning to Love, Serve, and Influence Our Divided World. And in many ways, I had to rewrite several sections of different chapters. I mean, gay marriage is now legal. We've had an African-American president. And we also live in a time where people are incredibly polarized. And so in many ways, I feel like it's a whole new book. Although some of the ideas of loving our neighbor and you don't get to choose your neighbor are still throughout the entire thing. And so it's been really exciting because we've had some youth groups use it as a kind of a series that they do in their small groups, and churches that even do sermon series through it. And so the hope is that people of faith will be known as peacemakers and reconcilers, and that we could kind of show a new way. You don't have to be blue or red in the political spectrum, but instead we can point people towards Jesus, whatever their beliefs are.
And in Austin, where you are now, and of course in LA and Seattle, that's all really important, right? Because, I mean, in Texas, there's probably lots of places that are, I don't know, very open to church. It's very church. It's Bible Belt, that whole thing. I imagine not quite so much in Austin.
No, that's right. Yeah, I grew up in Dallas, and so there was kind of an odd don't ask, don't tell kind of environment where, you kind of did your own thing on Saturday night and pretended like it didn't happen on Sunday morning. And I remember a girl in my youth group disappearing for us an entire school year and then coming back with a child, and we never talked about it. We never addressed it. We just had a little girl that would come to some of our youth events. And so, it was just kind of this odd, inauthentic, very religious environment. And yet I'm still very grateful for my childhood and being raised as part of churchianity. I mean, I feel like I did find Jesus, and I did really grow a foundation that I've been able to build on. But we definitely felt, my wife and I, called to really create community that points towards Jesus in places where they wouldn't necessarily show up on a Sunday. And being in Austin, about 13% of people in Austin attend church on Sunday. And so 87% are out on the lake or sleeping in after a bender the night before, or playing in the parks and, just enjoying outdoors. So we're definitely in a place that has for decades really been kind of the refuge from the Bible Belt for people in Texas. And certainly, like you mentioned, Los Angeles and Seattle have that same sort of edge to it. And so in many ways, it is a challenge, but it's a beautiful thing to be able to create community in places where we're introducing folks to what true biblical community, true relationship with God through Jesus is like.
Before we're recording, I was telling you a little bit about our church and how it was a new plant 12 years ago. I didn't mention that we, in preparation for launching the church, read John Burke's book, No Perfect People Allowed, which is like just a great phrase that your church has created and embraced and been part of your culture. And we embraced that when we were starting our church because we wanted that same kind of feel. And that was great for we had staff read it, but we even had core launch team members read it. We had banners. So we totally swiped your idea, by the way, which I'm sure great. A bunch of churches has since then. But it was helpful. So even then we knew of this, of Gateway Church, doing that and then I became friends with Kenny Conley, a mutual friend, while he was on staff there. So I'd hear stories from Kenny of what it was like in practice, the people you were reaching. I mean, I could think of stories right now of where you really were and are reaching people that you may not find in church very often, or may not be able to go to any church because they wouldn't necessarily feel welcome. So I would love to ask you, give us some handles maybe about how do you do that practically? How do you create an environment where people can belong before they believe, even if so much of their life they're just far from God? You know what I mean? And that's not part of their life. How do you do that?
Yeah. Another phrase that we borrowed from Nirvana about 20 years ago was "come as you are." And the beauty of that statement, as well as No Perfect People Allowed, is it moves people towards being authentic. And if someone is honest about where they're at in their spiritual journey, they're honest about their struggles, they're honest about their doubts, they're in a position to then grow and move forward. When we're, thinking we have it all together or acting like we have it all together, we're putting up a barrier between ourselves and others and ourselves and God. And so what we've done and tried to do here in Austin at Gateway, and as well as the two churches I was at on the West Coast, was really try to create a safe place. And I'll give you, like you said, some handles. One of the things that I thought was very helpful to explain what we're doing is if you think of your youth group or if your Sunday mornings, whether it's in the kids area or if it's in the auditorium, if you think of Sundays more like the Sermon on the Mount as opposed to the upper room, I think it would be a more accurate description of who you have in that space. And so it changes how we communicate the message of Jesus. It changes how we program. It changes how we're organized in many ways, because all of a sudden, when you remember that, well, in this space are the disciples, but they're also, like there were at the Sermon on the Mount, tax collectors and prostitutes. There are people that are far from God or don't know anything about God, and it really gives us the chance to obey what Paul said to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 14, when you gather, don't forget about the people among you who do not yet believe. And I think too often as pastors, whether it's in the kids space or the teenagers or even as senior pastors, we forget that, and we kind of communicate to everybody there as if they are already believing. But when we acknowledge, we're all in different places, and you might have some struggles or doubts, or you may have walked with Jesus for years, or you might not even believe there's even a God. Like it just kind of creates that space for us to be able to communicate in a way that clearly gives someone a next step towards faith or next step in growing in their faith. But it also equips our people. If you're communicating the truths of the scriptures in a way that even a person without faith would understand, then you're actually giving the tools to the people in your congregation or the other teenagers in your youth group or the other kids in your kids area. The way, basically, you're sharing with them how they can share the message of Jesus in a way that everyone can understand. And if you remember the Sermon on the Mount, in many ways, Jesus was compelled to speak on these little mountain ranges because crowd that was there wasn't welcome in the synagogue. And so our church, along with many others over the years, has tried to remove barriers between the person who's walked away from God or whose parents walked away from God or who's never connected with a local church. You know, you don't have to dress a certain way. You don't have to vote a certain way. You don't have to know the secret handshake in order to come and learn and discover that there is a God and he came to rescue us and his name is Jesus.
That's awesome. I love the reminder from Paul in 2 Corinthians about not forgetting those people. Because I feel like in church, I grew up in a church that we very much forgot those people, but it wasn't on purpose. You know what I mean? It was nobody ever said, hey, let's make it hard for them to understand what we're talking about or hard for them to feel like they fit it. You know, like nobody does that. It just kind of happens. I'd love for you to, and I'm giving you this off the cuff here, for people listening, maybe they have the experience that I had. They've been in their church for a long time, or their church has been around a long time. There's a culture there. What are a couple specific examples of how you can not forget that those people are there, do something differently to make them feel included? I think about it like, and maybe some of this is probably the No Perfect People Allowed book and the influence. Our pastor does a great job of this. So anything that's communicated in our services, it's very much thought through with the filter of, you know, who all is listening. There's definitely people who are here for the first time. There's people whose arms are crossed. There's people who don't know what that word means. There's people that don't know there's an Old and a New Testament. You know what I mean? And some of the interns that come in or residents will leave saying, they kind of joke like, I'm cursed now. I can't go to church without thinking, oh, that probably didn't make sense to somebody, you know? And I think our pastor loves that because he feels like, good. You know, you've learned. So do you have a couple examples for anybody that's thinking, what does that actually look like? Or how's that different?
Absolutely. Well, and one other danger in communicating to everybody as if they're already Christians, already followers of Jesus, is you could have someone in the crowd who isn't. And because we've told them over and over and over they are, they actually assume that, you know, they know all the answers to the Bible trivia, so they must be a Christian. They're in a church on Sunday, so they must have a relationship with God. And so I think making that distinction and acknowledging that some of you have not yet surrendered all of your life and followed after Jesus, and some of you may believe in Jesus with your head, but not yet fully trusted him with your heart, like that actually helps us even reach some of our folks that may have been around for a long time and are, you know, Christian more because they're not Muslim or Buddhist, but not actually followers of Jesus. But one real practical thing, you know, for your youth group, and by the way, youth groups and even kids areas tend to be better at this. And so many of those listening, they kind of naturally know we've got some kids that don't know Jesus. And there's, you know, whether it's the size of the room or just the pastoral ability that kids leaders have to kind of see that new face in a way that maybe it's harder in the auditorium. But even still, what you could do is, if you are a youth pastor or a kids pastor, to invite a neighbor to just come to youth group or come on a Sunday morning and just say, you know, to the parents and to the kid, if it's, you know, a 10-year-old or 11-year-old, somebody that you could have a meaningful conversation, or a teenager, and just say, you know, would you come and check out what we do? I'd love to get your input. We're really trying to create something that would be really meaningful for people, even people who don't normally attend on a Sunday. And if you would just come and be a part of a Sunday and then let me sit down with you afterwards, I'd love to just ask you questions about your experience. And I think something like that would be so valuable. And in many ways, it's a lot like what your pastor has done with your residents. When you are sitting in the crowd next to someone who does not know God, you listen to that message, you listen to the announcements, you listen to the worship leader so differently than you would if you did not have a friend in that room. And so to me, that's such a good exercise because, you know, we try to ask, even when we're writing a message, you know, don't forget TJ, and that's the guy in our church who's been walking with Jesus for years, but also don't forget CJ, and he's the guy who's kind of coming in off the street and doesn't know much at all. if anything. And so, if you're able to have that real practical secret shopper sort of thing and have a conversation, I think it could go a long way in helping you figure out what are the barriers we unintentionally have put up that are keeping people from understanding the message of Jesus.
Yep. How about with kids in student ministry? You were talking about how that we sometimes do that a little bit better. I would agree, especially in student ministry. I think in kids ministry too, but kids, it's easier for them to kind of, latch on and feel like they belong, even if they don't quite understand everything yet.
Yeah.
They're not as, by the time you're middle school, high school, you're more concerned about being embarrassed, right? Or feeling out of place or alone and all that. And so that just heightens it, I think. And so then as a student pastor, you have to even be more aware of that. So we probably are a little bit better, hopefully, in those ministries. But how can we do that even more? What does it look like to help kids and students belong before they believe and feel like they're part of it, even if they're brand new or they've been there for 10 years?
Yeah. Well, I think just creating the space for children and teenagers to be able to be honest and open with their questions. I mean, if they're going to public school or frankly, even private school, and they have access to the internet, these kids are being exposed to so much more than we were. And so when a child grows up in church, we just assume, they got baptized when they were 7 or 8 and they meant it. But we almost disciple as if they're not being mentored by the world as well. And so, creating the space where kids can belong doesn't just mean the non-believer coming in, and we'll talk about that too. But remembering that our kids are growing up in their faith and they're being drawn away from their faith by their friends, by their school, by the world. And so, just assuming everybody's on the same page. And not asking those questions. I mean, if you read through the New Testament, it's just amazing, especially, certainly in the Gospels, how Jesus just asks so many questions. And so for us to become good listeners is a very important part of creating a place where people can belong before they believe. But it's also something, when it comes to people without faith. I remember telling this story about a Muslim kid in our days in Seattle who would come to youth group, and he actually came every single Wednesday night, even as he went to the mosque on Friday. He started inviting more friends to our youth group than anyone else. It was a really amazing season, and I shared that story with someone, and she pulled me aside later, and I shared it with a group of leaders, and she pulls me aside later and says, I'm really concerned about your youth group. I mean, you basically invited a Muslim in. Aren't you afraid he's going to influence your youth group? I mean, how can you allow this guy to belong, even though he doesn't believe? And, aren't you worried about your kids? And I had this just aha moment and thought, what, actually, that's a great example, because our kids are pagans when they're born. We already have exercise in this. We know what it's like to allow someone to belong. Our babies, and then when they grow up and they get a little feistier, they're certainly cute, but I've read that babies start to lie as young as 6 months of age, and I have a daughter who's now 16, but when she was 3, I asked her if she wanted to be a leader when she grew up, and she said, "I'm already a leader." And basically, when about that same age, around 4, I asked her if she wanted to get baptized like her big brother, and asked her if she wanted to follow Jesus. And she said, "I already told Jesus I would be his leader." And I thought, that's not what I was going for. I am a pastor with a child who's starting her own world religion in which Jesus follows her.
Yeah, but and that's new. Well,
so we kicked her out of the house, right? Of course not. We were afraid of her influence on our son. Well, no, of course not. We had a meaningful and hard conversation. See, a loving community is both inclusive and willing to be honest. And so we just continued to love her and serve her. And eventually this little pagan became a follower of Jesus. And so we actually do this all the time. And we just need to start to see other people's kids as if they were our own. How did we treat our children? We allowed them to belong. We showed them the right thing. Erwin used to call this pre-evangelism discipleship. There's a great little story from our time in LA where a guy named Wesley, who was Buddhist, started coming to our church, and he loved it. And he started learning the songs, and he would come early to serve. He started giving money, he started inviting friends. And I mean, he was doing everything you would want a believer to do. He just was not yet a believer. And so he called Erwin up and said, "I'd like to get together for dinner with you on Valentine's Day. I thought that would be a great day to follow Jesus. I'm ready." He basically belonged with us. He became more like us, and now he was ready to believe, as we do, that Jesus is the Lord. And Erwin said, "Well, Wesley, I know you're still single, and you may not realize this, but I've got plans on Valentine's Day. I'm married." He said, "I think what we need to do is get together to talk about getting baptized, because you've already indicated in your heart that you want to follow Jesus." And so for him, he was discipled before he found faith. And that's really what we do is we try to disciple. We try to point people towards Jesus, the Great Commission, go and make disciples. And so we're trying to help point people towards the way, not expecting people without faith to live as if they had faith, but instead, along the way, once someone says yes, then we start to have some of the conversations that sometimes move into the realm of morality. So, for example, I write about in my book, Not Like Me, that, too often the church has made sexuality a litmus test for inclusion into the community, when in reality, sexuality needs to be a part of the discipleship process. Once someone comes to faith, the sexual ethic is then applied to their life. And certainly we can talk to kids, teenagers, adults about why God says, marriage is the right place for sexual intimacy. Like, there are sociological reasons, there are physiological reasons, and certainly there are spiritual reasons. But all that to say, I think as we create a place where people can be open and honest, and we keep pointing them towards Jesus, it's amazing when people say yes, how he transforms and even gives them the desire to walk differently.
When I think about it, in children's ministry or student ministry, one of the challenges for sure is not just doing that as a staff person, but, you're not probably in a lot of settings. You're not the only influence. Maybe they have a small group leader, maybe they're in a different class or something if it's kids. And you want to be that, you want to model that, but then you need everybody else to as well. What are some thoughts you have about making that culture go beyond the staff person? And now it's a volunteer thing, because you have that. I know you have that culture at Gateway. And I'm sure part of it is because it's church-wide, so it helps that, that's just the culture of the church. So by the time you volunteer, you've probably already sensed that. But for people that want to get more of that culture in their volunteers, what would you recommend?
Well, I think that's a really great point, because it's our volunteers that are face-to-face more often with the guests, and if we're doing things right, they're the ones inviting many of the guests. And so if you don't already have a culture that's kind of has a positive peer pressure towards this kind of environment, I think some of the things that I saw Erwin do, that I see John Burke do, is you start to tell stories of when people are doing it right. You start to reward when people are doing it right. Whether it's during a message, whether it's creating a short video where you're highlighting how a volunteer kind of went above and beyond to make someone feel welcomed, and having the hard conversation when you see someone that isn't. And it's interesting, because I'll get questions about, what do you think about this issue or that issue? And depending on where they're coming from, I'm trying to discern, what are they wanting me to say? But oftentimes it's kind of the far right or the far left that seems to have a hard time, because we're a place where we welcome people no matter where they are in their journey. And some people feel like that's not okay. Like Sundays are more like the upper room. There should be exclusive. People without faith and people who are living with their boyfriends should not be allowed in this place. And then you have others who, if you don't officiate everyone's weddings, then they feel like, you're not a safe place either. And so in many ways, we're trying to just follow the way of Jesus, and actually pointing people towards him, and knowing that along the way, people will discover that what he had to say is actually life-giving. And so really helping our volunteers celebrate when we're doing things right. So not only the rewards or telling stories, and then certainly having the hard conversations when it goes awry, but also, like you said earlier, personally embodying it as well. If you're talking about loving neighbors and bringing neighbors to a special event or on a Sunday or to a youth event, but none of your neighbors are coming, that's not going to translate into the lives of other people. And so, discipleship with our leaders is critical. And, you kind of, just like Jesus did, you go with them, and then they watch you, you watch them, and then you're debriefing before and after what went well, what could we have done better. And, it's really fun, because oftentimes some of the best insights are from our volunteers who have a friend sitting in the audience and are concerned about what was said or what was not said. And just, I love that we have a church family that's really looking out for the freedom of those who do not yet know Jesus to have a place to explore and find him with us.
So I have a question that may relate to this, but may not. It might just be my curiosity. I'm always interested in learning about what different churches do, how they function, what's their context like, what has worked well or not worked for them. And so you've been at Gateway now for a while. You were at Mosaic in LA, two different, but there's some similarities probably with the unchurched part of that culture. But what were some key differences or uniquenesses in ministering to families, since that's most of who is listening to this podcast, people that serve in family ministry in some way? What were the differences in ministering to families in those two churches and those two contexts?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So in 1998 is when I moved to Los Angeles. So, goodness, that was 20 years ago. And I was first a volunteer and then eventually helped with the high schoolers. So it's really weird, because a lot of those kids are now, almost 40 years old. So I can tell you there's certainly a lot of differences just in our culture. But I do think that a few things. Los Angeles is primarily a Latino city. And so I was the only white elder at Mosaic. So they called me the token bald white guy. And so just the diversity in Los Angeles, I think the LA school district, at least when I was there, had 180 different languages spoken. If I remember right, Los Angeles is the second largest Filipino city in the world, the second largest Salvadorian city in the world. Second only to San Salvador. So there's many cultures represented. And so that created some real challenges and some real beautiful experiences. And so really Mosaic has always been known for being very creative and very diverse. And at the same time, it's an expensive place to live. And so being more rooted downtown, when a lot of churches kind of moved out of the city, Mosaic moved into the city, and we had seasons when we had campuses all around, but there really was kind of a target audience for the 25-year-old, and there's not a lot of churches that are really good at reaching 25-year-olds, and even still they're just incredibly young, which is really beautiful and vibrant. And here in Austin, I've kind of joked with both Erwin and John Burke, how in some ways we end up reaching the 20-year-olds who went to Los Angeles and tried to make it in this world and didn't. So we reached the early 30s, kind of angry, broken, divorced with kids kind of person. And it's becoming a more diverse city, but it's certainly not quite like Los Angeles. The other thing about Los Angeles that's unique, or at least different than Austin, is you certainly have kind of more of a respect for pastors, and with a lot of Catholic background, there's kind of an honor towards pastors, whereas in Austin, I found it to be more the last thing I should ever mention in a conversation with someone new.
Yeah.
There really is more of an anti-Christian reality here. I mean, just within walking distance from my house on Sundays is a taco place that has hippie church every Sundays. There's a coffee shop that has Sinner's Brunch every Sunday. You know, there's just kind of an edge to the anti-Christianity. But I find that to be incredibly vibrant and fun because there's no acting like they are followers of Jesus. You know, and someone else pointed out to me recently, she's a pastor up in Minneapolis, and she pointed out, you know, 10 years ago we were dealing with more, and this is a good analogy too, my time in LA, it was more like teenagers asking, how far can I go? You know, there's what is right and wrong. And then now, you know, we have kids, you know, who wonder, you know, why there's even gender identification, you know, like it's just so different within 10 years, how the conversation has shifted. And so, and I feel like a lot of that certainly is true here in Austin, just kind of pushing every boundary. Here in Austin, you know, we don't have straws. We don't have plastic bags. You know, we just are, there's probably more dogs here than people of faith. You know, we're so, just different than what I grew up with. But it's a place that absolutely, is coming alive because of Jesus. And when you see someone who's anti-Christian or has never been around, you know, genuine faith, I mean, it is dynamic when you see them embrace the message of Jesus and see the transformation in their life.
So I guess the no straw thing was similar for you for both cities, or at least it would be now, right? Because that's like, that was a big thing in the news recently with LA or California in general.
That's right.
I am not surprised at what you were saying about kind of the anti-Christian vibe there in Austin. Yeah. I get that makes sense. It feels like, you know, everything else I've heard. And you even referenced like the gender stuff. So much has changed since you first wrote the book. And it's changing fast. I mean, in our current political climate, I think everybody would probably agree the middle is going away. You know, people are pushing out to one side or the other fairly quickly. And as you rewrote the book, did you end up having to think about a lot of that? And what did that, you know, what did you write that would be different than you wrote 10 years ago?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, some things I wrote about, I mean, it's remarkable, really. I mean, 2005, when I wrote it, I wrote the chapter on politics. I called it Loving Liberals and Compassionate Conservatives. And I used immigration as an example of how, you know, most followers of Jesus are kind to immigrants. And so, you know, we should never let political parties, you know, basically co-opt our vote or our voice. Because as someone who in Los Angeles, I was reaching out to immigrants, you know, it was incredibly important. And so literally it was almost like I wrote it as if everybody knows, like even at the time, President Bush, a conservative, called himself a compassionate conservative and was for immigration reform. And so I used immigration as a good example of how not everything we care about is white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, Republican, you know. And when you include people of color who are more on the blue side of politics, you know, it just starts to complicate things. Well, gosh, 10 years later, you know, you bring up immigration and it's like, you know, there's a litmus test, you know, what do you believe about immigration? And so that's why much of what I wrote in the book or added to the book was certainly with kind of a group experience in mind. How can we have meaningful conversations in this time when conversation is no longer allowed? And I'm telling you, what's really powerful is to be able to stand up on a Sunday and say, you know, look around. In this room are people who look differently, who voted differently, who make different sorts of choices than you make, and we are all in the same family. And we come together because we're trying to follow after Jesus, or we're here because we're curious if Jesus really could make a difference in our lives. And most of the time, we work with people like us. We live next to people like us. We're related to people just like us. And so the church is actually one of the places where meaningful conversations about really tough subjects can take place. A quick little example, on the night of the election of 2016, I pulled my life group together, and there was a young woman new to faith, her and her partner, recently married now, but at the time we're still just living together. And these two women, both coming to Gateway, trying to sort out what they believe about God and Jesus. And then there was an older gentleman who's kind of moved here from North Carolina. And, he obviously voted for Trump. They did not. And we had this time together praying. And at the very end of our time, the last person to pray was one of these women. And she just prayed the most beautiful prayer with tears in her eyes, asking that God would bless Donald Trump, that God, would you help Donald Trump, if he doesn't know you, find faith in you and find the life and freedom that I'm discovering. And I mean, she wasn't just crying, but this guy who voted for Trump was crying, and they embraced after, and so in that room, you have completely political opposites and yet both praying for our president. And I just think that the church has a real opportunity here in the midst of so much division to live up to who we are called to be as peacemakers, as reconcilers, that we can actually be different than the rest of the week. We can be different than what they experience online. And so it's been really challenging, but it's been really beautiful to be a part of a community that's really committed to reconciliation and peacemaking, just the way Jesus intended.
That's awesome. Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done there, right? But
totally, yeah.
It is interesting how in some ways I feel really good about how the progress the church has made at being more compassionate and loving and accepting, and you can belong before you believe, and all of that. And then, but it is harder because culture in some ways has gotten almost worse. It's different because as long as you don't have any convictions, well then culture's great with you. Because whatever, as long as your convictions don't say anything about somebody else's convictions, do whatever you want. But the middle ground seems to be disappearing everywhere, in church world and politics and everything else. And so that just does set up a little bit more division and stuff like that. And you're right, the church it is the answer, but now is a great moment for that because these other things aren't doing that. These other things aren't uniting people and bringing people together and all of that. That's really good. Wow, that's awesome. How can people connect with you? Where's the best place to get the book or to learn more about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you'd like a copy of the book or take a small group through it or your leaders through it, we have a discounted rate right now at ericbryant.org. And then you can just click on the book. And if you click on resources, you'll also see we have something called the Church Growth Summit. It's free interviews with several different pastors across our country, and Alan Hirsch and Erwin and John Burke and Hugh Halter. And then I also, there at ericbryant.org under resources, you can see things that we do like the Church Growth Workshop and things like that. But we're here to serve, and just grateful, Nick, for your ministry and the ways you're investing in all of us and helping us do a better job with kids and teenagers. Just really grateful for what you do.
Well, thank you. The feeling is mutual. Thanks for the book and your influence at two churches and more that have really just made a huge difference. I think about just even my own personal faith, how much I've learned from afar from Gateway and from Mosaic. So thanks for that and for the influence on the church and Christians overall. It's been huge. I bet you there's a ton of churches that have taken some of the community and the open sense of belonging and diversity of Mosaic, and at the same time, I know there's tons of church plants because of being connected in that world that have embraced the no perfect people allowed and that whole thing of Gateway, which is just great. Our churches should have all of those things, right? So that's awesome.
That's right.
Thank you for that.
That's right.
And for the book. And thanks for taking time to talk with us about it. I appreciate that. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Nick. Keep up the good work.
Wow. Love that conversation with Eric. We could have talked for hours, I think. I just love hearing his perspective, his heart, his humility, the fact that he lives this out. You know what I mean? We were talking afterwards a little bit about his experience at Mosaic, and he was saying how Erwin McManus, that working alongside him, he's one of those people where he was more like his writing than even his writing seemed. He said, sometimes you might read something from someone or you hear about someone, and as you get to know them, there's a gap or they're not as much like that. He said Erwin was the opposite. He was even more like that in his own real life than he is in the writing. And I feel like that's the same of Eric. He really is that person. He, helps people belong. He connects with people who are not a part of any church, invests in them, helps them take steps, disciples them. So that was a great interview. I really enjoyed that. A few action items I think of coming out of there would be to get the book, obviously not for me, but read it with some intentionality. Like read it with the idea that we're going to put into practice or review some things about our church or our ministry in light of this book. Are we doing a good job speaking to people who are in the room that aren't believers yet? Kids, students, or whatever that might be. What could we change to make them feel more welcome? How can we make them feel like they belong before they believe? Another action item would be just to create a simple plan. I don't want to encourage you to develop like all comprehensive strategy that you're never going to do. What's one or two things you can do to get this idea and this culture and this mindset in your volunteers? Because we all know that's where it needs to be the most if it's going to show up in your ministry. So what's one or two things you can do in the next month or two to get this idea in them to help people belong before they believe? So that was a great interview. You can get all the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 116. Check out his website as well for the discount on the book and those other resources that he mentioned. And then, like I mentioned when we started, be sure to check out ministryboost.org for the free webinar this Thursday and orangetour.org to attend a stop near you this fall. Well, that's it. Hope you have a great week. I'll catch you next time on the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.